This is episode 57 of Art Talk, and today I have a very special guest of whom I'm super excited she accepted my invitation. Let me introduce you to Kristin deGethaldi. Kristin deGethaldi holds a BA in chemistry, an MA in art conservation from the Winterthur University of Delaware Program in art conservation, specialising in easel paintings. She has a PhD in preservation studies from the University of Delaware. She has held internships and contract positions at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, my museum, the Getty Museum, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She has maintained a private practice since 2008 and continues to be involved with teaching art, conservation, and technical art history at the graduate, undergraduate level. Kristin has also been involved in a number of web-based initiatives, including the CREST Technical Art History website and MITRA, the Materials, Information and Technical Resources for Artists. Welcome, Kristin. I'm so very happy to have you as my guest.
It's my pleasure.
So, what attracted you to become a conservationist, a restoration specialist of art?
Right. So this is a question that conservators get most often. And I should say right from the start, I know the terminology is confusing sometimes. From the US to Europe, you'll encounter restorer, you'll encounter conservator. So just for clarification, we tend to identify ourselves at the professional level in the US. As conservators. So that's the term I'm going to be using. But but just understand that depending on what country you're in, that term can change. So I became interested in conservation. Everybody has a different story and a different path. No one really follows the same path to this very strange small field. But it's a very special, unique field. So I went to a liberal arts college, which was a very good fit for me. And so much so that when I knew I was always going to pursue a science degree, but I was also at a liberal arts school, in the US, you're generally encouraged to take courses that are outside of what you're majoring in. So I had a very good advisor who saw that I'm interested in art and art history and recommended that I take a semester abroad and only focusing on those things. So I did that. And I lived in London and Florence for my semester abroad. And I fell in love with art and art history there. And I encountered the concept of art conservation over there peripherally. And then I came back and we did some more research, and he found out, he helped me do research. This is in the beginning days of the internet when it was starting to be useful. And so we identified that there were graduate programs in the US. So I looked into getting into the schools here in the US and realized that I was shy, definitely a few courses, and the amount of hours it takes to get into the schools here is exorbitant. So you need a certain number of hours to get in, to apply. So it's a sort of a catch-22 situation, and students are still facing this today. It's a huge challenge. So you have to build up a number of what we call pre-program hours before you even bother applying. So I recognized that I had 0 hours, but I needed a few more art history classes. The schools generally, you basically need a triple major to apply. You need to go through science, at least through organic chemistry. You need to have a certain number of art history and studio art courses. And you also need, so the three, so studio art history, science, but you also need, like I said, that a big chunk of that is the hours. It could be volunteering at your local museum, helping with rehousing projects, survey work, or working, volunteering, interning alongside a practicing conservator developing your hand skills if you're lucky to get such an opportunity. At the time, times have changed drastically. I called up a bunch of museums that were in the Midwest where my undergraduate college was based, and nobody knew what to do with me or frankly wanted me because I was a science major. And they said, well, we don't know if we can use you. You majored in science. Now it's very different. They'll scoop you up with a science major, but that shift was still happening at that point in time of recognizing the important role that science plays in our field. And now it's very much recognized. So I decided to take out loans and go to Italy again, because there was a program there, which is no longer in existence. It unfortunately, I think, was terminated more or less as a result of COVID recently. But it was the Studio Art Center's international program in Florence, and they offered a year-long post-baccalaureate program. And I applied, got in, like I said, took out loans to go there. But it paid off tremendously in the end for me in the long term, because I was able to rack up hours there that counted towards getting into the schools back at home in the US. Or frankly, I didn't know if I was going to go back to the US or not at that point. I was open to looking at other schools in Europe as well. And then ultimately I ended up being hired by one of the professors there, who was a 4th generation art restorer, Italian man. He was wonderful. He didn't speak any English. So that was a great experience though, because I was given hands-on opportunity to work in a very well-established Florentine art restoration studio immediately. Wow. So there was no room for, and it was a fast paced because it was in the private sector. So we were, and he hired 2 or 3 of us, and we each had a job. So my job was retouching or in painting. So that was my job right out of the gate. And I fell in love with that. And that really, sitting down at the easel for the first time and retouching a painting, I knew I was pretty much hooked from then on. And that's what I needed to do with my life.
Oh my God, I can imagine. I can only look at those pieces and study the brush, but you can touch it. Wow.
Yeah. It's a pretty unique experience.
That must be, absolutely. I mean, I can imagine the thrill. And so with all this, the education you need, also science, and you say that has become way more important, which I can imagine, and we come to a part of that later also. But also technical art history. And how is it with your artistic being? What do you need that? Do you need to have a kind of artistic talent when you restore those, when you go with your pencil into the artwork of a master?
A very, very good question. And it's one that is very close to my heart, literally, because I'm married to a paintings conservator as well. We met in the graduate program at University of Delaware, and he came to this field in a different path. He obtained a BFA at the Art Institute of Chicago. So he was a painter before he entered the field. So before I met my husband, I found myself, so I entered I didn't have a ton of studio art experience. I had enough to apply to get into the program, but not a ton, especially with painting. I'd only ever painted with acrylic paints a few times before. Most of my studio art portfolio, because you do have to submit a portfolio of studio art work, and they want to see a wide breadth of, so I had a sculpture, several etchings that I had done in a printmaking class in my undergraduate time. And then I love pastels and charcoal drawings mostly. So that was the main strength of my portfolio, but not painting. But I always loved paintings. Every time I was in a city or traveling, I would just go to the museums and couldn't stay away from the paintings. Just couldn't. So when I got in, I found myself in all of a sudden, after a year of work at the University of Delaware, in the middle of Los Angeles, at one of the most prestigious institutions, the Getty, in their conservation studio, and I was recruited specifically for my retouching skills. But many hours retouching it's very repetitive, and you spend a long time reflecting and thinking about things at the easel, because our job is very slow and methodical. So I began reflecting on realizing that I had still some gaps in terms of my education. And if I was going to be fixing paintings, easel paintings my entire life, I realized that I needed to know more about the actual craft of making a painting from start to finish. So I realized this was not something that I had done. It's not a requirement for any of the schools. It's a nice thing if you are able to have that opportunity as a pre-program student to do that. Not very many students do, because the people, my husband is one of them, the people that are out there that have that knowledge and that artistic ability to teach that skill are few and far between. It's hard to find them. So I phoned home. I phoned my mentor, instructor, Dr. Joyce Hill Stoner at the University of Delaware, and I said, I need to make a painting from scratch. I want to use all the original pigments. I want to plane my own panel. I want to make my own gesso. I want to make just from start to finish. So I spent a year as an elective course doing that in addition to my other studies for my that was during my second year. So that was very eye-opening. And that was my first foray and interest. That's where my interest began in technical art history, because you really see how much you don't know until you work with these materials, which are tricky, and all of the variables that go into, literally from start to finish, from the ground up, as we say. That was a big, that's really where my interest in technical art history began. And I've done projects ever since that moment throughout my career to help better inform myself, but sometimes hopefully the field as well, because my husband and I try to publish, or with other colleagues, we'll try to publish our findings and what we discover along the way when we do these technical studies.
It's so interesting. And I can imagine, I know from my own studies, and it takes, it takes years to learn a skill, a proper skill, like side size, like model, portrait, etc. Skill, it's a true skill. But I also know that when you paint on canvas, how Rembrandt did this, the gesso, the Venetian red, the gray, or the ochre yellow as a second imprimatura, and it's so important to know that. It's so important to know that you start with thin and then go to thicker layers.
Yes, absolutely.
Otherwise it gets a mess. Oh God, must have been thrilling to do that. It adds to what you do when you approach a painting like that. It's what I can imagine.
Yes, it does. So if you know how a painting is constructed, or how an artist and his or her workshop tends to create paintings, and that can change over the course of one's career as well, right? You have early Rembrandt, looks very different from late Rembrandt. So knowing that, and then if somebody brings you a damaged painting that's attributed to that artist, then you have a lot more knowledge on your side, and you can sort of perceive, okay, I think I know how this painting was meant to appear. And you do your best, because but it's invaluable to go to as many museums as possible and collections and just look and look and look, but also read the literature and stay abreast of current knowledge and current findings. And those two things together are very useful when we are confronted with difficult and challenging projects at the easel, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I get to that in a question. And you work on old masters. A lot of the more modern art have become now already old masters. So
Yeah,
I've
I
heard of.
actually work, I actually work on everything now. And
Oh, okay, yeah.
yes, I do. And it's because the private sector has demanded it.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
though I'm based in the smallest state, one of the smallest states in our country, in Delaware, there are 5 to 6 art storage depots here, all owned by different companies. And Delaware happens to be the Geneva, Switzerland of the US for tax reasons.
Oh,
So
okay.
there are an incredible number of amazing artworks being stored here. I should say that most of the art depots that I work at, they're all running out of room and they're starting to expand because so much art is coming here. So I get more calls these days with problems to do with modern contemporary, and we can get into that later. But yes,
Yeah.
my traditionally my training has been on old master paintings spanning from 1300 to 1900. However, my husband and I have done a lot of technical studies on turn of the century artists as well. So it's interesting how much knowing how to read the literature and to research, fugitive pigments and be aware of just the materials in general, that helps to inform me every day when I'm looking at modern contemporary pieces, because I can identify problems right away, just with that foundational knowledge.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. I had a whole discussion with my framer, who also, for his clients, they come in and they have a painting and it just comes off. And he says often they use a wall primer to prime the canvas.
Yeah.
That's not for, I said, how can you do that? So those people have no former training.
Right.
You see now that they use acrylic and oil and ink all together. And I have like, okay. So I heard also a museum curator, and it was in the Netherlands when I still lived there, once saying that it would be great if artists knew their materials and create work that can be preserved. So you restore paintings, which simultaneously make them conserved for the future, hopefully. How important is it for painters now to make work that in time can be restored? And have you seen modern art that was beyond restoration?
Right. All good questions. So my husband and I have dedicated a good number of years to doing collaborative endeavors with artists, living artists, and also working with art materials companies like Gamblin and Golden. Kramer, you might recognize that from in Europe. There's a number of these companies, Natural Pigments, which is based in California. There are a number of companies out there that recognize that this kind of knowledge is lacking in the art community at large. It's not being taught in schools anymore. Sometimes, occasionally, at ateliers, it might be, but it really depends on who the instructors are. And even then, these people are retiring, and this is not knowledge that's being transferred to the new, younger generations, or even not so young generations anymore.
Yeah.
So so you mentioned one of our web projects, Mitra, so MITRA.
Yeah.
It's a free forum that is hosted by the University of Delaware that anybody can join. And you can post technical questions on there as an artist regarding, we get anything from varnish, artists that are struggling with varnishing, to layering. Can I mix this material with that material? How should I display my painting? How should I pack it and transport it? And we have a lot of informational packets that you can download for free. And this is not just this information is not just coming from myself and my husband. It's there are a number of forum moderators on there who represent, they have different expertise. So someone from and then we try to also have people that can speak for each of the companies. So there'll be a golden rep on there who is familiar with Golden products. If somebody comes in and says, I'm using this varnish from Golden and I'm not sure if it's working correctly. So we've tried to do that. So we recognize the importance of having a forum like that. And then, yeah, we've tried to give as many talks as we can, but it's hard to reach. I would say that in general, this knowledge is lacking. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I would say there's pros and cons, I think, to giving this kind of information to, if you think of a young, impressionable, emerging artist who's trying to absorb as much as possible at the beginning of their career, you don't want to scare them too much. And it's okay. I think a certain level of experimentation is warranted and necessary for them to find their own paths and the materials they like and the method they like to use. But I think it's important to plant a little seed, just a little one early on, so they have this dialogue in the back of their mind. Okay, I've decided that I really like this effect in these materials. What's the best way forward for me to use all of those things and then produce artwork that's not going to fall apart in the next 6 months? You know, like that's really what we're talking about sometimes.
Yeah. Now 6 months was a bit quick, but yeah, I can imagine.
We've seen it all. So so the second part of your question, have I seen artworks that are basically not salvageable? Yes, absolutely. A really good example comes to mind where this painting must have been about anywhere between 5 to 10 years old. It's a contemporary piece. The artist is still living. The problem with this painting, it was very large, probably 8 foot tall, 12 foot wide. And this artist is primarily known for their use of fluorescent colors. Now, these fluorescent pigments are notorious for fading. They fade if you look at them hard enough. Some of the colors, particularly the reds, the pinks, they will just fade to like a neutral beige color, or like a faint salmon.
So no light then.
Basically. And I mean, they will fade in the dark. Some of them will even fade in low lighting situations. They're just not stable. They're meant to be ephemeral, bright, punchy, right then and there, used for, I don't know, in black light settings, I don't know, but they're not, the way that these dyes are made, they are just prone to being very fugitive. So this artwork, you know, it was made and published in a catalog or a gallery for a gallery's opening. And this particular, but you know, a lot of her paintings have sold. She's done quite well, but this one, it sat in storage for a bit. And when the gallery pulled it, it was a ghost of itself. So they called the artist to see if she would repaint it. She said no, because it's theirs now. They own it. It's out of her hands. So then they called me and asked me to repaint it. And I said, absolutely not.
That's also,
But, you know, they didn't know. They asked if this can be saved. And I said, no. And the problem is you're stuck with a painting that is a far cry from how it appears in the published catalog. When it first got put on the wall, it's a ghost of itself. So what do you do? I don't have an answer for that. So there is, so there are things like that we can convey to, you know, young artists or artists in general.
Should be in the education, you know. I teach it when I have someone who wants to learn how to paint with oil. I teach it, because if you don't teach it, they end up very frustrated anyway. And they can't get the colors out. They have no clue how to set it up. You see straight through the canvas. because they didn't use any gesso no underpainting, imprimatura. And even then, canvas can still have something. But yeah, I think it's something that you need to learn. And even I do it constantly because the paints change. I mean, more paints nowadays are opaque.
Mhm.
How do you work with that? Because it or not opaque, they're transparent.
Mhm.
And only when you really start to grind your own painting, your own paint,
Mhm.
you can make opaque paints. But it is a challenge. It is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, and I would say that, student grade paints that you buy at the store, I mean, they're going to be full, quite frankly, you get what you pay for, of
Yeah.
junk, of fugitive pigments, dyes,
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah.
the actual. And this is an ongoing discussion and problem within industry, how much there are on certain tubes number rating systems, and we
Yeah.
have a
No.
guide on Mitra to walk people through how to read that. But a lot of people just buy the tube for the color and they don't bother reading on the label. But it's important sometimes. But yeah, no, having some sort of accountability to industry standards for making sure you label what's in there appropriately. They're not going to label everything, of course, because some of these mixtures are proprietary, but at least at the very bare minimum, what pigments are in there, the primary binder, and some of them don't always do that. Good companies will list that information, but it's a challenge. It is.
Yeah, but when you use paints like Old Holland, for instance, that's pure pigment and linseed oil.
Old Holland is great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, comes from Holland.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what kind of decisions do you need to make when you get a painting and you see former restorations? Do you need to do more research to see what the painter originally did and bring the original painting back? Or is there also some kind of respect for the way of thinking at that time of restoration as part of these decisions? And I imagine that your science comes in here too.
Yes. So it's definitely changes case by case situation. If you have a painting that is very well documented before it has been damaged or subjected to inexpert cleaning, shall we say, or restoration, then that's a blessing. I mean, we don't get that very much, but it does happen. And so you at least have documentation in the form of photos, even archival photos. Maybe the damage is quite small and you're able to fix the area and you have an idea of the layering process, and so on. I should say that we don't tend to use, sometimes we do, but there's this idea that we use the original materials that the artist used during our process, and that is not always true. In fact, I'd say most of the time it's not true, because we want our materials to be chemically different and distinguishable from the original. So we do have paints that are specially made for conservation that we use. So no fugitive pigments. I know that the pigments I'm using are going to not change, but also the binder. So we don't use oil paints when we restore oil paintings. That's a big no. And we don't use, and we don't use, it's because oil, I should say 80%, 70% of the time I'm restoring an old master painting, I have to remove maybe retouching that was put on in the 1920s, 30s, and it's oil paint. So I have to remove some, and it's discolored or darkened. So oil paint does not age. If you put on oil paint from the 20s and 30s onto an old master painting from 1600, 1700, that fresh oil paint that was put on in the 30s and 40s will shift in color and tone over time, and it will discolor. And you'll be able to see that from a mile away. So we, in several years down the road. So we've learned from that as our field evolved out of a craft. We were, craft-based profession, and now we are considered to be a formal profession. So we've learned from that mistake. So our paints, they tend to be acrylic based, or an aldehyde resin. They're different synthetic resins that are very reversible, meaning I will spend 5 months retouching a painting sometimes, and somebody could come in and take all of my retouching off with just one solvent in 30 minutes. Wow. So that's how reversible they are. So the idea is all the materials, including film materials that we add, are chemically, most of the time, different from the original. So you can distinguish our work from the original if you were to use UV light or chemical tests. There's that. So in terms of pigments, sometimes I may use bone black or earth colors that the original artist used, but sometimes I might not. So Red Lake is a good example, because we know that I can't use Red Lake pigments that the original artist used because they will fade. I know that if I were to use genuine Black Lake or Yellow Lakes in my conservation paints, it will fade, and you will be able to see it will become distracting over time, and then it will get pulled off the wall and it'll have to be retouched again. So the idea is you want your work to hold its own for as long as possible, so the painting doesn't have to be messed with quite as frequently throughout its lifetime. So the pigments so we use different pigments that are more stable for that color, let's say. So we don't always use, and I don't use lead white to retouch. So we'll use, I tend to use titanium white.
Titanium,
And so, which is challenging because titanium white is not, it's a different hue than that warm color that lead white imparts. But there are things you can add to it that will help. So we do have certain pigments that we tend to stay away from, and that are not always chemically the same as the original.
That's quite a challenge, I can imagine.
Yes.
So you have to really look per project, per painting, and on that base, from the research you do, what to use, how to use it, etc.
Yes. Yeah. And the same goes with varnishing. I will not yet. So some people still use Damar varnish. Some restorers do, or even mastic, which is fine. They are beautiful varnishes. They go on, they irreplaceable in terms of getting that wonderful old master satin glossy finish. However, we know they yellow. That's usually what I'm taking off most of the time on paintings. It's these old yellow mastic and Damar varnishes. So we have at our disposal today many synthetic varnishes that have undergone extensive testing to make sure they don't turn turbid or go gray or yellow discolor, and that they remain reversible over time. And so again, the varnishes that we use they don't tend to be, so increasingly more as we go on as a field, we tend to use these synthetic varnishes that have been well tested. So that's also an important difference when you're talking about the materials we use versus what the original artists used. Now that can change when you deal with modern contemporary. Everything can change when you deal with modern contemporary. So it's a case by case basis with when you're faced with modern works, and especially if the artist is still living. We always try to reach out to the artist. Sometimes they don't respond, and that's fine. Our feelings are not hurt, but we have to, especially if the artist is of, considerable note and quite famous now, and they're busy and they have a whole workshop at their disposal. They may not want to be bothered with a question about a painting that they did several years ago that now has conservation issues. It's not a fun dialogue to have. Especially when it's been sold, maybe 2 or 3 times over. So it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. But some artists are very good at responding and providing us with information about the materials they may have used during that time, and that helps us and helps inform us going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Brings me on the idea. Well, I always use Rembrandt or Winsor and Newton,
Yeah.
The professional paint, and I'm now transferring to Old Holland.
Yeah.
Because that's best. And my wish is to make my own paint. But
Sure.
yeah, so in a way, also for contemporary artists, and that's just something that comes up with me, it would be very good if you make a note what you have used.
Yes. We
Because
encourage people to do that on our Mitra site. Yeah, if you could, I love it when I get a painting and the artist has scribbled notes on the back of what they use.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very useful. That's very useful.
No, it's very good to do, because I had a conversation with an art mentor, and she worked in the antiquity, etc., and shops, and she said, always create art that sustains, because it can end up somewhere, but it comes back and people sell it. So make sure that it works. So it would be really good to put on the back or in a note what you have used,
Absolutely.
what pigment you use, what linen you use, what varnish you use. I always only use retouche varnish, but yeah.
And I would say, I would even go a step further. There's some artists in the history of time that have decided they do not want, no matter what happens, restorers and conservators messing with their paintings. And sometimes they will tell us from the grave on the back of their paintings, please do not restore this, period, ever.
Wow.
And that is also useful. And if somebody wants that to, there are artists that embrace the concept of just, degradation over time. And that's maybe important to them, and they want that, and that's absolutely fine. But you need to document it so we know.
Yeah.
For example, Anselm Kiefer is a good example. When things, little bits of paint might fall off of his very, very, very large, complicated surfaces, he told us not to bother reattaching it. Don't worry about it. And so that's very useful information to have.
Yeah, but I can imagine that with him, because he has a specific philosophy and what he does and why he does it.
Right.
So
all of this needs to be conveyed to us, though, because at the end of the day, if there's any problems, we're the ones that get the phone calls. So we need to know how best to proceed in considering the artist's wishes, for sure. Now, of course, this can sometimes be, there's a gray area there in the private sector, because if you own the piece, it's yours. And you can make the final decision as the owner, but at least you can have this dialogue with the current owner of the piece that, well, this artist wished for this to be this way. If this, if there's a problem area in this painting, they have made it known, he or she has made it known that they don't care, and that's fine for this area to keep changing and just age. But, if you make the owner aware of that, sometimes they will embrace that concept, but not always. So we have to have, sometimes a compromise.
Yeah. And do you have to restore it so that it also can be taken off again? So there is no Kristin anymore. We are years ahead, and they find a painting. You did?
Yes. So so this whole concept of reversibility. Now, we really have to be honest here. Is everything we're putting on the painting absolutely 100% reversible? No, probably not. And, if you go down to the molecular level and take a tiny sample of the painting, you could probably find traces of the material that I'm using, but that's, that's just a fact. You can also find traces of dirt from, and varnish from other restoration campaigns that have happened over hundreds of years. So, but we try to do the best we can with the materials that we add to the painting. Now, there's cases where I don't want my material to be reversible. For example, if a painting comes to me and it's flaking badly, and it's losing the paint is sloughing off layers of paint and ground,
Yeah.
I need to consolidate that immediately so that nothing more is lost. And I don't really want my conservation adhesive that I'm using to be terribly reversible, because that could lead to another problem down the road.
Yeah.
So but we still document all this. If you're working with a professional conservator, they will generate a report, and anything that's left on the painting needs to be listed in there. What you used, from the consolidation to filling to retouching material to varnish, all needs to be listed for the next generation, and for the owner to have that. It's very useful. And I'm dealing with a survey right now of somebody that a collection, and it was restored. Several paintings were restored in the all the way from the 30s to the 50s, and this restorer wasn't always good about documenting, but he documented enough that it's very useful to let me know what I'm going to need to tackle in months ahead when I sit down with these paints. He used oil paints to retouch, so that's useful for me to know that.
Yeah.
And so we definitely need to. We definitely are required in professional circles to generate these reports that hopefully stay with the artwork. They don't always stay with the artwork, but hopefully.
Yeah, because I saw yesterday that you wrote, can you please also document that what doesn't work?
Yes. And I think the post you're talking about, yes, so that also, that's to do with conservation science. So the studies that we're doing, yes. And documentation is so important in all facets of our field. And we're not always, people aren't always good. I know it's easy to get wrapped up in the project and the artwork and everything, but documenting it needs to just be considered as part of the process, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, not finding is also finding.
Yes.
And that's what I learned anyway in art history. And I had to make a note of that. So I can imagine. And in this case, when you go through this and all the different parts you need to get to that specific part, especially when you work with certain chemicals to restore artwork, you need to know as much as possible. I mean, it needs to be evolving, right?
Yes.
And then, and why would you find out the wheel a second time if it's not necessary? Oh yeah, I already knew that it didn't work. Yeah, why didn't you document that? Then I wouldn't have got the whole way. Yeah, I can imagine that.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
I mean, I would say that most of the time the challenge is not so much trying to find out maybe what the artist used when it comes to old master paintings. I mean, we have a pretty good idea, although there's definitely some artists that pose challenges all the time. But the challenge for us tends to be, what did this last restorer use? Because as a field, we haven't been good, I mean, restoration has been going on for hundreds of years, but we've only really just been self-recognized our field as a profession, formal profession in the last 100 years. So 150 years. So documentation has gotten better during that time, but before then there's nothing. And so you really have to be an investigator and be aware of historical restoration practices, which is also a whole nother kettle of fish.
Yeah.
But there's two things to consider: the original intent and materials of the artist, and then when was this last restored and how many times over, and what therefore
and
the
what
material
and what was used.
Yes.
Yeah. So in this whole restoration and I am very interested in that always, but provenance is more important than ever. And I've seen a program here in the UK. It was called Fake or Fortune.
Yes.
And there were people involved that did the science. So they see the spectrums, and that shows, I can't read the things, but they can. and they say, okay, here you see those blues are used, and that is a specific. So it's like this is cerulean blue, and that was that type, and that wasn't there in that time, something like that. So it's fake, or according to the spectrum, everything is possible.
Right.
So you have that, and then you have an art historian, and you had the gallery owner who obviously knows a lot about the art and is an art historian himself. Who do you believe should be involved when it comes to finding out if an artwork is real or fake?
Right. So there definitely needs to be the triumvirate of the art historian, the conservator, and the scientist. But that is in an ideal setting, an ideal world. It doesn't always happen that way. But if you are going to actually pursue a provenance research and attribution, you need to, if you can't get them all in the same room, at least reach out to, those three different entities.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's fine to just do an art historian and a scientist, or an art historian and a conservator, depending on the skill sets of the conservator and the scientist, but it's best to have all three. Yes, so there are certain what we call signpost pigments. And my husband and I think we have this up on the CRES website. If we don't, I will go check. But it's a very useful document, and we are constantly trying to update it, because we, as technical research goes on, we may find out that, oh, this pigment was actually available a little bit earlier than we thought. So there are, for example, zinc white wasn't around until 1894 or so. So we have these dates that are hard on, so before then you shouldn't expect to see this pigment, and after you shouldn't. Now, that being said, you need to watch out, because we've learned, for example, trace amounts of zinc can naturally occur in earth ores when you're mining. So our instrument, this is a constant problem. Our instruments keep getting more and more and more sensitive, and they're picking up a lot of data, more data than we can handle, sort of analogous to what we're dealing with in the technological world at large. Too much data, and it's hard to process it all. And quite frankly, I know everybody's watching quite closely the information that's coming from the technical research and study of the Night Watch restoration. They have years of data they're going to have to go through, because they've scanned every pixel, or every square inch, megapixels worth of data. So it takes a lot of time to go through this, but the instrument that you usually see on Fake and Fortune is called an XRF instrument. And so what an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. So it's a looks like a ray gun. And it doesn't hurt the artwork at all. It's non-destructive, which is great and fast. But there's pros and cons. What they're not talking about is that there's pros and cons to every instrument you use. There's no one instrument that will be the smoking gun. It's rare. You might get an instance where you will get a smoking gun situation, but it's not frequent. So what the XRF instrument does is it goes through several layers at once, sometimes, if you're dealing with a painting. And then it will tell you all of the elements that it's seeing. But it's up to you to figure out, where are those in the stratigraphy of the painting? And is it restoration? And is that zinc part of the ground or a part of this earth ore naturally? Or is it if you're not expecting to see zinc white there, is it restoration? So that's why you have to have a conservator there most of the time, because they will be aware of where to actually point the gun, where the appropriate places to take the analysis. There's also been, I've seen a couple of these shows. Some of them are quite good, and some of them, I question, the results that are touted at the end. For example, if you're trying to attribute a painting by an artist you analyze the color of the red paint, and it's the exact spectrum profile of an artist that's of known, or a painting that's of known provenance, solid provenance. You know it's by this artist. The spectrum matches the red paint over here. But what if you're talking about a painting that's after 1900, after the advent of tubed paint? Everybody's using the same color of tube paint, and if they're not admixing a lot, and if there's just large areas of primary these colors straight out of the tube, of course you're going to get the same spectrum. And it might not. That to me, that is not good enough evidence to confirm that this painting over here of questionable provenance is definitely by the artist over here. You need to do more in-depth, comprehensive research, and really what the instruments are best at is showing you when something is a fake, not when something is the real deal.
Yeah. Well, they did this in this program. They really went to trace back owner to owner to owner to preferably the artist itself, if possible.
Yeah, I mean, the science is only really good at telling you when something isn't. And if everything checks out, to be fine, to be period appropriate, and consistent with the materials that we know the artists had available or used, there's still open questions, because it still might not be by that. So that's when the art historian's role becomes increasingly more important, and provenance research in terms of archival information. And so the science it helps to cross off certain things on the list. The science does, but it's not. It's touted by the media a lot as being the smoking gun, and it actually rarely is the smoking gun.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, well, you've been in the Netherlands, and you know it. You know Amsterdam, Rijksmuseum, and we had our fair share of forgers. One of them, Janssen, he still lives. He did his jail time. And somewhere in a video he said, yeah, you know, there's still, and he used the frame, the canvas, the pigments, everything from a specific time. And he said, there's still paintings out there in museums that are fake. I won't say anything, but I know they are. And there are many. And he said, there's so many people, like art sellers, dealers, etc., who have what you call in that the butter on their head. They know, they just know. And so, yeah, what I liked about this program is that they do the whole, there's a PhD art historian who really tried to trace things back. And you have the scientist, and there's an institute, the Couteau Institute, at one point was there, and they still said, no, it's not. So, yeah, I think it's good. It's good that they go deep. You know, there's too much. Too much.
And you have to,
fake.
it's seldom that one professional alone can do this kind of research. You really do need to have a collaborative effort, for sure.
Yeah. And talking about news, and I'm interested, so I read things, but I also recognize and acknowledge that I have gaps in my knowledge. Hence why I ask you, because I'm absorbing. So in a comment, that was about a secret substance found in a Da Vinci painting. And you said, oh, another clickbait. So now, well, I know tempera, agar binder, but I never heard that oil, which has linseed or walnut oil, has egg as a binder. So what did they try to do? And why is that fake news? Why on earth do they do this in the first place?
Well, the main thing I would say is we just don't know still what these Quattrocento painters really used. We just don't know. We have an idea, but we don't know the precise. And this is an instance where the media picked up on conservation research and just took the wrong message and ran with it
Mhm.
because it's more attractive, and people then will read a secret ingredient used by Rembrandt. That's also come up. Secret ingredient used by Leonardo. I mean, it's very enticing title. And of course, people will click on it. The fact of the matter is, if you read the article, the actual article in Nature, I think it's Nature Communications, it's a group of scientists, some of whom I know well, one of whom served on my PhD committee. And the reason why I felt compelled to comment, this was my PhD topic. So the transition from egg tempera to oil in Quattrocento paint. So the article focused on reconstructions. So they are scientists playing around with different reconstructions, which I am always a fan of, because not enough scientists do that. Actually make the paints and then themselves. And usually if they're smart, they'll collaborate with a conservator, but sometimes they don't need to. And they'll make they'll reconstruct historic recipes, grind things, and then perform whatever tests they want. So this article was focusing on egg oil formulations and what that looked like when you run it through instrument A or instrument B, and then talking about the rheological properties of what that does to the paint, the oil paint, when you add egg. That's pretty much it. That's the article. There's a little blurb in the article that then mentions, we found some traces of protein in some of these old master. So they cite other articles. These are from years ago, and they are it's older research, and it's from their tiny samples that were collected from a number of Quattrocento paintings subjected to analysis that we now know to be problematic. So think about finding protein in a painting. Well, there's protein in the ground, isn't there? There's glue in the ground. They've also been subjected to lots of campaigns of consolidation in a historic, especially if they're on panel paintings, right? Historically, glue was also used to consolidate things. There's also, so when you're looking for proteins, you're looking for amino acids, the building blocks of the protein molecule. So they're looking down to the building blocks, but there's amino acids in lots of things that we don't consider necessarily to be protein. Same thing with the markers that we use to identify oils, so fatty acids. Fatty acids are the things that we see them on when you open a chocolate bar that's maybe a bit old. There's that waxy substance, that whitish haze. Those are fatty acids, and sometimes that are migrating up through the chocolate to where the surface is. That happens on paintings. We know this. So fatty acids continue to move throughout the matrix of the painting over time, and they're also leached from the painting when harsh chemicals have historically been used to clean them. We know this. So the markers that we were relying on in years past, these amino acids, trace amino acids, also looking at different ratios of fatty acids, we now know to be sort of problematic, because pigments can bind with certain fatty acids. I mean, you may have seen research talking about metal soaps. That's what that is. Pigments interacting with fatty acids, and they lock onto each other. So there's so many variables. And in fact, my colleagues came out with a very good article about this. It's in a book about this big, about the Quattrocento paintings in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. So there's a tiny chapter in there about dealing with the complications of identifying these things and not being able to concretely say, oh, Leonardo definitely used egg. We don't know. All we can do is report what we find and then leave it there. And maybe the next generation in the future will be able to make more sense of it. But right now, we really, it's hard to make sense of it because they're so old. These paintings are so old, and we know they've been restored. By the time they come to us, they're 500, 600 years old. They've been restored 5-6 times over, at least. So there are, and if we're looking at the tiniest of chemical markers, we don't always know where they came from.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's difficult, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep pursuing. You know, there are, my dissertation focused on a specific type of instrumentation where you take a cross section and it basically scans the cross section and it tells you information about pigments in each layer, but also where are the amino acids, where are the fatty acids. Instead of what normally happens is we take that sample, we shoot it through a tube, and we just see, oh, there's amino acids in there somewhere. Oh, so we don't know where they're coming from. So at least have an idea layer wise where these markers reside, and that is invaluable. But this instrument is very expensive and rare and hard to come by. So there's logistical issues there. But so that's really why. But you know, we see this, we're used to clickbait things happening all the time in our field, and it's usually just a journalist trying to, you know, make a living and on their research, but also misinterpreting it, you know. So
it's something that you see often in the media in general, not only art, but with a lot of things. It's and it's a shame. I have like, okay, it's these can be really interesting things to read, also for not specifically people like artists like me who have an interest in knowing and learning, an art historian like myself too. But I do not have all that information you have, simply because my education wasn't like that. So I could be interested in reading that, and then I fall for something and have like, how is this then working, and why, and where can I find this? And it's a shame. It puts you on the wrong leg, in the wrong direction.
Yes, it's just unnecessary distraction sometimes.
Yeah,
I do like that though. The good thing that comes from these clickbait articles is that it does incite interest in artist materials. So at least that's a good thing that comes out of it, and then it opens up more dialogue that way. But there's some correcting that has to go along the way with that.
Some, So I read also a comment you made on a post by an auction house to be more careful with art, and to me that was a shocking image of paint really scraped off of the canvas on the corners. And the canvas was damaged too. So how often do you see work that is damaged like that by not taking care of it enough? And what does that say about auction houses and their true care for art?
Yeah, so the unfortunate, it's this unfortunate running joke in the private sector and the staff that work at a lot of these Art Depot storage warehouses. We see more often than not damaged artworks coming out of the auction houses. Most of the time it's fine, but it's it's just for example, there was one instance a couple years ago where it's clear that this auction house was using a framer to reframe Quattrocento, Cinquecento Italian paintings with wood that was infested with wood-boring beetles. So in examining the auction house photos of the painting before sale, on the lot auction websites, which still are up for a number of years even after the artwork got sold, there were no wood-boring beetle holes on the face of the holes from, because these beetles, they bore in to the wood, they lay their eggs, then the larvae, they hatch and they bore tunnels, and then there's exit holes, and usually they push out a little bit of sawdust or frass, so you can tell when they're fresh, the holes. So I looked at the artwork and there were holes in the front of it that weren't there comparing with the lot auction, and it was clear that when they were getting reframed, whatever woodworker they were using was using wood that was infested, and they were sitting and then they get sold, and then they get wrapped in plastic and or in polyethylene and crated, and they sit for a number of years just like that. And it's great for the bugs after.
Yeah.
So if you don't catch this kind of thing soon, it can be a real problem. And of course, the art depots don't want to have bugs in there wandering around their
Nobody
collection.
wants bugs in there.
That's right. But yes, the auction houses are not always the most. Once these artworks get sold, it's out of sight, out of mind. It's that if they're sold, that's great, and they don't need to worry about it anymore. The condition of the
But you
paint.
get the private owner, right? When
Yes,
the
so
damage has happened.
I have some clients that there's one in particular, I feel so bad for her. She's so careful about and cares so much about what she wants, what she buys. And she really loves art. But every other time she's bought something, it's arrived to her broken or dented and so now she's smart, and she has, I wish I could convey this to a lot of collectors and buyers. It's best to send a conservator to lay eyeballs on the piece before you buy it, because you can then identify any damages are there before the sale, and also after you buy it. It's still at the auction house, and after you buy it, they take it off the lot, and it goes into a warehouse. It's schlepped around, and who knows what happens there. So before it gets shipped, have a conservator go and look at the piece before it gets crated to make sure between the time of the sale and before it leaves the auction house, that damage hasn't occurred also. This is not always possible, right? To have the conservator go up and look at it. But what you can do also is to request a condition. The auction houses don't volunteer this, but for maybe higher profile works, they will have a conservator already come in and write a condition report and a technical summary of the painting. And they keep that in their records. They don't volunteer it, but if you know to ask for the report and any technical information like a UV shot, sometimes for fancier things like a Rembrandt, they'll have an X-ray. You can ask for all of this information, and if they have it, they should give it to you. And if that doesn't exist, then the next step would be to try to see if you can get a conservator up there or over to the auction house to look at the piece before it leaves.
Because auction houses, when you buy straight from an artist, like when you buy from me, you come here and you see it, and you know what state it is. And also, I love my art, so I will never ship it in a way that it gets damaged. Right. But at least it's an investment. And in auction houses, that is not the art that you buy with me, for instance. That is in thousands. I mean, 10,000 with me, okay. But those go even higher than that and into millions. You don't want that damaged.
Correct. And also, when they acquire pieces, the auction houses themselves, they may come poorly packed or crated. And it's not really their incentive to spend the money to properly rehouse them or recreate them. It costs money to do that. So sometimes it's the housing that these artworks come in that can cause problems. And so they often won't bother dealing with that. And they'll send, so you'll buy an artwork in a crate that's just terrible. that is not up to standards, shall we say, and can cause potential issues. So that's also a problem. So yeah, it happens, not a lot, not every day, but it happens enough that it's a known problem amongst us working in the private sector. It happens all too frequently. But I don't know, see, they have such big insurance policies. It's just not worth it to them. They'll have their insurance pay, every so often to cover the damages, instead of perhaps investing a little bit more and educating their staff, art
Yeah.
handling staff, and have, you know, and investing the resources to properly care for things like that. However, things may be, I've seen some signs that things might be changing. Some of these auction houses are teaming up with good, reputable Art Depot companies. So that's a good sign. That means that people that care and know how to professionally deal with these problems will be on the receiving end of, you know, a lot of these artworks until they go to the lot, to the sale. So that's a good thing, but, you know, slow steps towards progress.
Yeah, and necessary steps, definitely. I mean, art is not just something. There's a lot of love in the creation by artists. Well, for me, that is. And for the collectors, private collectors too. They mostly love art.
Yes.
So when you are the in-between person, then make sure that you love art, or don't do the job. Do something else. Go to the market or something, and whatever you throw around.
Right.
Yeah. So something really different. What has been the most exciting piece you worked on?
Oh, it's hard. What's exciting piece? Probably. So I'm a bit different. So some people, I have worked on big names, many big names, painting. And while it's very thrilling and exciting to do that, you know, a Monet, a Rembrandt, Van der Weyden, the thrill for me is really it's a challenge, the project.
Mm-hmm.
If it tests my limits, if it's difficult and I'm able to persevere, I love projects like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the most exciting, well, the most challenging one in recent time, there's two. So one may still be online floating around somewhere, and it's the restoration of a 12 by 20 foot painting that's attributed to Pietro da Cortona, that's housed at Villanova University right now, that I worked on with a crew for 2 years, a team, and the painting, quite frankly, was an absolute wreck at the start. Just a wreck. Missing yards of paint along the outer edges and in some places, actively flaking in others, bulges in the canvas, at least 3 generations of hastily applied, inexpertly applied oil paint to cover up some of these damages, and 2 to 3 surface coatings of varnish and grime. And that was a huge project. And we worked on that for 2 years, like I said, and we were able to do a large amount of technical research, but also we were given assistance by the courtesy of the Crest Foundation to go over to Italy and look at a lot of his paintings, but his workshops paintings, and affiliated artists, or artists that are commonly associated with the circle, to get an idea on how to do loss compensation on areas of paint that were like this big missing from the canvas.
Wow.
Yes, because it probably sustained water related damage at some point, because we know it was housed in a castle in a small villa outside of Rome. It was probably flanking windows that were open from time to time, and so the outer edges of the painting were in tatters. So that was a huge project and very exciting, a little scary at times, but exciting. It turned out very good in the end. I'm working on a huge project now that will undoubtedly be one of the biggest projects of my career. It is a huge mural by N.C. Wyeth, his biggest mural. It's roughly 20 by 60 feet long. So it's not very small. And unfortunately, it was deinstalled from its original site that it was intended to be at for years and years. It was deinstalled somewhat improperly. So it was the mural's in 5 sections, and each section was rolled, which we typically do with large format works to store them and to transport them. We put them on large sonotubes and roll them. However, the crew that was enlisted to do this rolled the painting paint side face in, which you never ever do. It's a 101 that we learn in conservation of paintings. So, and they rolled them on sonotubes that were too narrow. So if you think about rolling up an easel painting like you would a poster or something, paint side face in, it's not going to go very well. You're going to compress the paint layer and there's going to be tiny cracks and lots. Yeah. So that is what we're dealing with right now. They're not in terrible shape, but there's definitely lines of loss in the paint layer that we're dealing with, and other large structural issues that we'll be faced with down the road. So that, because of the sheer size of these paintings and the weight of the canvases, the ground is a lead white base, and then they were adhered to the wall originally with lead white paint. So it's a lot of lead white on the back that we're not necessarily having to deal with yet, but that's going to take this project will take several years, but I'm excited to see it up again, because it's been languishing in storage since 2008, this mural. So it'll get a new lease on life in the next few years.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Must be so exciting to see something so damaged coming to life again, and just the idea that you worked on that to make that happen.
Yeah, I know, and there's a lot of people who really rallied around the cause to save this mural. So it's a community group effort to get this painting out of storage and up and visible again so the public can access it once more, like they used to be able to.
Yeah, and recently, there's more and more information about female artists, and also in the Renaissance. And those have been totally ignored in art history. So I knew about this, but not as much, since I read a book called The Story of Art Without Men by Kathy Hassel. Have you ever restored work from a female artist?
Not an old master painting per se, because they are very rare. They were not considered to be collectible for many years, right? So not a lot of now we're seeing museums tout or celebrate or announce when they're acquiring pieces. They're actively trying to buy them. That was not the case beforehand. So in my career, I haven't encountered very many old master paintings by female artists, but one painter that I have worked on who's just fantastic, Rosa Bonheur. She has the most wonderful life story, and I encourage everybody to go and read up on her life story. She is a very skilled painter. So I've worked on a painting by Rosa Bonheur before, but more and more I am working on paintings by female artists that are alive, or who, modern contemporary artists. So a couple of paintings, Georgia O'Keeffe, more recently Edna Andrade, Jennifer Bartlett. So there's a number of Pat Steer. So there's a number of modern contemporary painters, female artists, that I continue to work on every year, which is nice to see, which is good. But yeah, I've participated in a number of technical studies and research on African American painters, of which we have not very much. Oh, Alma Thomas is another one that I've worked on. So she's an African American woman, DC, based in DC. She was based there for much of her career, and I've worked on a couple paintings by her. But my husband and I have been able to participate in technical research associated with Henry Osawa Tanner. And also more recently, we're about to come out with an article relating to Basquiat. So
Basquiat, I've done a lot of research into him.
Yes. Yeah. So, but in both cases, focusing on materials and techniques that they use. So it's nice. I've seen my colleagues also doing more of that sort of thing with that kind of research with female artists as well. And it's nice to see. Yeah.
Yeah, and necessary. I mean,
Yeah.
she writes that here in London, the National Gallery has just 1% of their total collection is by female artists.
That's right.
And then the majority is men, white men, and a few black men. So we didn't even speak about black female artists.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yes. No.
And if you look at the progression of art in the Western world, that wouldn't be there if there hadn't been African art to start with. So,
right.
Yeah.
No, it's and this is where so it's funny. We didn't necessarily seek out our research direct that involved looking at Sawa Tanner's paintings. My husband and I just fell in love with his art because it's clear he loved experimenting with just bizarre paint formulations. And he was a little bit obsessed about that, almost tortured, I would say, towards the playing with these different, very particular complex paint formulations that he'd make himself. And he would write on the back sometimes what he would use. But the effects that he would get were incredible. There were beautiful surfaces, not without conservation problems, but very unique and and he's actually, as is the case with Basquiat, and I assume that this is going to be happening with female artists. You know, in the last 20 years, being able to buy paintings by African-American artists, particularly men, it's become a trend. And these artists, Tanner and Basquiat, are highly sought after in the market. And we've now seen, I personally, an explosion of fakes and forgeries to do with both of these artists. The Orlando Museum just got a lot of bad press for their Basquiat education. So I'm getting, unfortunately or fortunately, lots of inquiries from random collectors or dealers, demanding that our research relating to Basquiat. We're in the process of publishing a paper, but it's because of this issue that the market is being flooded with all these fakes.
And also because he when he was in New York, when he was painting, he did something on a refrigerator. He did something on on the wall, etc. And when he passed, suddenly that became valuable.
Yeah.
And so he made so many little scribbles and everything. And it is something that will happen. And I think especially with Basquiat. And I've seen a brilliant exhibition here in London, but because you see only from people who privately collected his art, and that came here together. So that is a rare vision of what he created over his short lifetime.
Yeah, it's hard. One challenge that we encountered when we were carrying out the research on his techniques is obviously access to the paintings, because a lot of them are privately owned still. Yeah. And many are overseas, but we had some good luck and fortune in collaborating with the Andy Warhol Museum, for example. They have some of his collaboration works. And then I was able to go out to the Broad in LA and examine some of their paintings there. So it's and in addition to privately owned works, but it's very hard to a lot of these collectors know that there is this problem out there in the market, and so they're often reticent, and rightly so, to open their own collections to individuals who want to research. But when it comes down to it, we have very boring and dorky questions as conservators, I would say. We want to know the pigments that were in his oil sticks and the binders that were used and the layering. So we tend to not have, we're not sniffing around for anything else besides that. So, yeah.
Last question. If you could have a conversation with one of the old masters you restored work of, who would you like to speak with, and what 3 questions would you ask him or her?
Oh, that's a good one. Probably because my dissertation was on, I spent a number of years in angst over trying to understand the materials used by Quattrocento painters in this very strange, relatively quick transition from painting in egg tempera to oil, which are completely opposite, different medium. Like, you could not be any different. And I think that this is something that, you know, the general public doesn't always know or understand, and why would they unless they've messed around with these paints. But egg tempera paint dries right away, immediately. It's very unforgiving, so you better know what you're doing.
Yeah, same
Oil
with
paint,
acrylic. Yeah.
yes, that's right. And so oil paint is a little more forgiving in terms of, you have blending time. You can go in and manipulate this area later, sometimes hours later, depending on the drying time of the oil you're using. So it is such a huge shift in handling and just the manipulation of the medium that there's maybe a handful of Antonello de Messina is one. So he's from Sicily, who was probably one of the earliest to adopt oil. You know, and there's a number, Ghirlandaio, Botticelli, most likely. And then, yeah, even Leonardo. I mean, just to ask, how much of your career did you use egg tempera, if ever?
Mm-hmm.
And then what compelled you to pick up this, you know, completely opposite, different medium? Who taught you? How was it introduced to you? And what did you like about it so much that you kept on using oil? You know, so it's, I mean, I think I sort of know the answer to the third part, but the other two I don't know at all. And I think it's like one of the most interesting, when you're talking about technical art history, one of the most interesting questions, because of the difference of those two medium. They're so disparate, and it's not intuitive to go from being in egg tempera, trained in egg tempera and gilding that we see suddenly, and then it's just completely about face. So to be able to learn more about that shift, and if you look at that time, it just so happens to coincide with, you know, one of the most important, the Renaissance, one of the most important, you know, explosions of art. Also, the adoption of oil allowed artists to use canvas. You know, you cannot use tempera on canvas. So you just have to glue the canvas down to something solid. Yes, so it's those would be the questions I think I would ask a number of artists working at that time. I don't know, it's the best I can come up with.
No, yeah, I can completely understand. Yeah, just interesting to hear that. But thank you so incredibly much for your answers. Learned a lot, and I know for sure that a lot of people will love this and will learn a lot from you, because as much as that we paint, and by the way, also art historian who listen, we need also kind of this information. We need to know what we do, right? And I think that what you just gave us is to be aware for artists to know what they use, how they use it, and learn about the medium as much as possible.
Yeah. Yes, it is important to be aware of the materials that you're using, and what you don't want to get a call from a gallery rep who's irate with you because your paintings are flaking onto the floor. You know, and these are paintings that you did a year or two ago, or maybe the varnish is doing something terrible that you didn't expect. There are simple things you can do to avoid getting into that situation.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so incredibly much.
Well,
where can people find you?
Oh, I'm not very much on social media. I have sort of abandoned most social media. I'm on LinkedIn sometimes, commenting on things as they roll across my feed, but I'm behind I have not had a website on purpose for many years because I have plenty of work, but I've gotten so many complaints about not having a website from clients that I'm going to have a website in the fall. So, but I highly encourage people to visit the CRES Art History Technical website, and also MITRA, MITRA, the forum there. If you have burning questions about materials and techniques, you can always reach out. There are contacts, for to submit queries on there, but also, don't hesitate to reach out to the conservation department at the University of Delaware. They're very good at funneling queries to the appropriate people. And many of the conservation graduate programs are that way. So you can find your local, in the UK, the Courtauld is very good. If you're into object conservation, UCL is also another good one. Northumbria is another program in the UK. So just look up, nearby conservation graduate programs. They're going to be the most helpful, I think, in terms of fielding some of these questions, because many of us in the private sector are very busy, or many in the private sector are different from me, not interested in outreach, which is fine. But I think it's best to reach out to the programs to find, out more about technical information, in general.
Okay, I will look those up and I'll put them in the show notes. I really want to thank you for being here and for talking with me. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you.